Hello, thank you so much for joining us. We're here for another installment of our college admissions and testing webinar series. And I'm Bari Norman, and I'm going to pass it over to our moderator, Leslie Singer. Just a couple of quick pieces of housekeeping before we get started. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section as opposed to the chat. We'll see them a little bit better. We're going to try to get to everything. And without further ado, Leslie.
Hi, so I'm Leslie Singer, and I'm thrilled to be here with Bari Norman, the co-founder and head counselor of Expert Admissions, and Sasha DeWind, the CEO of Tutor Associates. While I'm in real estate, I just always am thrilled to be able to provide added value to my clients. We have a lot of questions to get to, a lot of material to get through. So I'm going to get started, and I think what we first want to do is a survey to see what grades we're working with.
Yes.
So I'm going to.
All right. So if you could let us know the grade level, if you're a student, if you're for the student, or if you're a parent of your student. We always like to tailor as best we can.
Yes.
All right. Things are still coming in, so just giving everybody time. So we still have some people coming in, but it looks like it's staying pretty steady at about 69, 70% 11th graders. Next biggest group is 10th graders. A quarter of you out there are in 10th grade. And then we've got a small number of 9th graders and 12th graders. So we'll adjust as we can, but we'll have information for everybody.
Perfect. Let's start with testing and what's new in the 2021 for standardized testing. What's new and what's the same? So Sasha.
Thanks, Leslie. Yes, there are some big changes since last we spoke in December. The College Board recently announced that they are doing away officially with the SAT subject tests, as well as with the optional SAT essay that's always been a part of the SAT. So that's big news in the testing world. I think if you've been tuning into these webinars, you've been hearing Bari and me say, listen, these things are fading out quickly, and the past year has made it really quick. So we were sort of expecting this, but the announcement this past month has made it clear that even those colleges who were still maybe hanging on to subject tests, there won't be an option for kids to take them past June. So that's big, and the essay as well, leaving the SAT. And you know, from my perspective, the essay was never something that was important to the admissions process. It was always something that we just wanted kids to take because it was a required feature and because we like kids to be confident whenever they have to do anything they have to do. But frankly, the SAT has always been about the verbal and the math. The ACT has always been about that composite of those 4 sections. So for us, this doesn't change much. They really just got rid of things that were already pretty unpopular.
Yeah, and I can add just from the admission side, if you can believe it, I actually don't even know the scale for the SAT essay or the ACT. I think they're different. I don't literally know what they're out of. So that's how little they mattered before. I never asked anybody what they got. I don't even know the scale. I mean, that's how like uneventful the news is. So it made big headlines, but this really was a non-issue for those of us in the admissions and testing world.
And the ACT, what's new there?
Yeah, so nothing except that, you know, both the College Board and the ACT have sort of shifted away from rolling out online testing, which was a goal certainly of the ACTs and also of the section retesting. These things have been delayed by COVID-19 and by both companies' renewed attempts to just get kids testing safely by paper in testing centers. So no changes there. The ACT is kind of just plugging along. But what we're focused on for all of our juniors and then our sophomores as well is making sure they're just testing at the right times and that they have safe testing centers for testing.
You already said that the essay wasn't that important, but would you recommend kids taking the March test just to do it?
No, you should take the SAT when you're ready to take the SAT or when your child's ready to take the SAT. If that's March, fantastic. But the essay is really not a reason to make any adjustments to your tutoring plan or to your official testing plan.
Yeah.
When
It
you
really
talk-
mattered for nothing before. Like you did it if you know, just to make sure in case there was a one random school that said you were required to submit it. But even for a school where you were required to submit it, not that I can name one off the top of my head, but there were some, it didn't matter. You know, it really didn't. So you really shouldn't adjust testing like at all based on this.
You adjust some changes in SAT, not so much in ACT, changes in APs by any chance?
Yeah, this is important because in some ways the APs are just going back to the old AP format. So last year, our students experienced a very different AP season. APs went online and were sort of shortened versions, abridged versions of their normal AP format, and kids had a really hard time with some technical difficulties. So this year, again, we see these companies focused on how can we get kids testing in person. So what they're doing is adding dates. You know, normally APs are once a year. You sit at your school, you take it, everyone's sitting the whole, and that's it. They're adding multiple backup dates should your school be closed for testing. And they are offering a final online version should those sort of in-person tests not happen. So they're just really committed to having kids take the full real APs in person at their schools and having this backup option. So it's changed in that it's going back to how it was, and that they're really working on adding backups because of school closures.
Well, are juniors testing and
Yes.
planning to test, and sophomores and
Yeah, good. So fortunately, all of our seniors who wanted to tested. We're so happy they got to, mostly because they worked so hard and were so frustrated that they didn't get to show their work. So I'm so happy they did, and that's great. And we're now eagerly awaiting admissions decisions for those who didn't go ED. Our juniors, some of them have already tested. Some of them were even done. Those ones who worked really, really hard over the summer, and lots of them are sort of weren't ready to test anyway. So they were testing in February or April or even June. And others did have test cancellations in December and will have test cancellations in February and are therefore delayed. So we have all sorts of things happening with our juniors. Some aren't ready to test, shouldn't be testing. Some have already tested successfully, and some are frustrated with cancellations either on the SAT or ACT front, which are site specific and are either trying to get other testing sites or are delayed in their testing.
what are you recommending when there are cancellations? What are you suggesting people do?
Sure. You can call the ACT or the College Board and see if there are any seats available. Sometimes there are, oftentimes there are not. If you forget to register or you are not able to test, you can sign up for standby testing. And essentially, though you're not guaranteed a spot, having that ticket and being ready to go, most of our kids have gotten in via standby testing. But for us, we're just focused on getting our kids testing at the right time for them, right? We don't want to rush things and we don't want to delay things too much. And so for our kids, if indeed their schools are canceling, we really want to make sure that they're not burnt out, that they're not over prepping, and that we're making sure that we adjust their programs to these changes.
And can I just hop
Yeah,
back?
please.
Just I'm looking at some, while you were chatting, I was looking at some of the questions coming in. For the AP exams, they're back, like Sasha said, they're back to full length, like no more like kind of halvesy, like kind of at home kind of thing. But it is the case that a school can make the decision to not hold it in person. And the AP coordinator at your school is the person who does that, of course, in conjunction with any administrators. So if your school is closed, for instance, chances are you're not going to be taking it in person in your high school, but your school makes that choice. And your school could be open and they can still decide to give it electronically. So you should really check individually with your high school what their plans are for the APs. So for those of you who have school closures, again, you can probably assume, but those of you who are open as well, your school may have already chosen to do it digitally. So just ask your AP coordinator. There are things in place for because of closures or because of just concerns about the virus.
Many schools continue to be test optional this admissions season. Should my child skip the testing?
No, yeah. These schools have to be test optional in a climate where there may be students who truly cannot test. And if you are one of those students, certainly no admissions officers are understanding and want to be understanding of students who are going through extraordinary circumstances. Everyone else who can test, they want to see scores. They wanted to see scores before. Everyone who applies to Bowdoin, which is test optional, I mean, so many, it's like 80% apply with scores, something like that, because that's what Bowdoin wants to see. So what we're going to see is that those kids who maybe were on the fence about testing to begin with, maybe they were already kind of going to test optional schools. They would have a few years ago, maybe they wouldn't have ever tested. It really may be the time for them not to devote this time to test prep and to other things and to take seriously their academics. And for those kids where maybe they were on the line, we're much more likely to counsel them out of test prep, which is really great. And they can showcase their skills elsewhere. But for those students who were always going to need scores, who were always focused on getting the kinds of scores for the most competitive colleges and universities, they're doing the same thing they've always done. Maybe the scheduling is a little different, maybe it's not, but they're all prepping, and that's really important to their testing, to their overall portfolio, to send those scores if they can.
For many, the subject test demonstrated a proficiency in a subject, and with the elimination, how some of the more competitive schools used to rely on the subject tests, and what are you recommending instead?
I'll let Bari weigh in on that.
Okay,
I think that's an admissions question, really.
Yeah, the subject test, the interesting thing is so often at admissions, recommended really means like a wink, required. But when it came to subject tests, at least in more recent years, and I don't mean like the last 2 years, but in recent years, it really meant recommended. And what that translated into is if you could go in easily take it, and take 2 unless you're Georgetown and it's 3, but you could take 2, hit at least in the 700s certainly, but ideally really more like 750 plus. You would go in and you would take them, you would submit them, and that would be that. And if you couldn't, you wouldn't, and that would be that. And it really was that simple. If you could show good scores, whatever that meant to the schools that you were applying to, you would do them. So they haven't been super relevant for a while. Again, we would always have students take them if they could. It was nice to show them if you could, but it really didn't change things. The thing that really mattered was your SAT or ACT score. Without that, it didn't matter what the subject test scores were. And very rarely do you see a student scoring super low or relatively low on the SAT or ACT and then like really killing it on 2 subject tests or 3 subject tests and vice versa. So it usually doesn't give that much more information to the colleges. Good test takers are good test takers. They get good scores on both kinds. And if they don't, then, so as far as the subject test goes for like subject mastery, they're really looking at your transcript for that. The subject test could be helpful in contextualizing grades if they didn't know your school as well. Sometimes students have a really tough teacher. And so you might get, a B+ or an A-, and then you get like a 780 on, a subject test. That could be helpful information that obviously the class was difficult, but you really clearly learned the information. But it really doesn't, I wouldn't call them a demonstration of mastery, of material or anything like that. So it really, for me as a counselor, that announcement too really just wasn't that big of a deal. It didn't change the testing landscape. Like it really didn't. It was kind of like Sasha said earlier, an expected announcement that came a little bit unexpectedly early. Like if they would have said it at the end of this season, we're not doing them anymore, I don't think anyone would have batted an eyelash. They basically said in January, they're done effective immediately. So people were just like, oh, wow, like that was fast. You didn't even let us finish out. So kids were in the middle of prepping. So that was the jarring part of it, not the news itself. So I wouldn't change things drastically academically just because these subject tests are gone or the essay is gone. And a question that came in, which is a common question I get, is now, even if your school doesn't offer APs, should you be taking APs now? AP exams, I mean, because there's no subject tests, and those are going to count more. And the short answer to that, and at some schools, by the way, particularly in the New York area, that's a common practice that kids will take AP exams to take them separately. And if that's something that goes on at your school and is fairly typical, it's one thing, but I would also not start studying for AP exams when you're not taking the AP courses, unless there's a good reason for you to be able to demonstrate some kind of level of, and I don't want to use the word mastery from before, but some kind of level of knowledge in a particular area. So if you had a lower grade in a class and you felt like taking an AP could show that, again, it was a tough teacher or there was something going on, maybe. But as a general rule of thumb, I wouldn't suddenly start taking AP exams and spending all year preparing for them when you're not in an associated class that naturally prepares you.
Yeah, and I should add to that, everything Bari said is exactly what I say. You know, an AP exam is like the period at the end of a sentence, right? Like the AP course is the sentence, and sure, we expect the exam at the end, but if you're not taking the course, nobody expects the period at the end, right? And for some kids, there are some easy wins. I've seen a lot of kids who just do the AP Lit without really prepping much, or they're just in such an advanced calc class or whatever it is that they want to take the AP, and it doesn't detract from all these much more important things that are happening from an admissions perspective: the grades, the ACT, SAT, the extracurriculars, the sleep and mental health and all that stuff too. And then I should also say that in terms of taking them for credit, I mean, I do think there is something there. I mean, colleges do still often offer college credit for high AP scores. That's not something a lot of our high schoolers think about because they just want to get in. But I do know it really helped, me when I place out of French. You don't have to take some requirements. You get out of certain things. And some kids have even graduated earlier. So I do think some kids do appreciate that, though that's less of an admissions thing and more of a college thing.
In terms of proficiency, would you recommend, I guess this is more a Bari question, for a student to take a more rigorous course or potentially take a course where they know that they can get a stronger grade? Like, what is your recommendation?
Yeah, if you ask this question as at an information session for a college, they say, take the harder class and get the A, ha, ha, ha. And of course, that's not helpful. And the answer is that there isn't like just a flat answer, because it's going to depend on the student. But I'll tell you the different variations. In an ideal world, sure, you take the harder class and maybe you get an A minus, not an A. But when it goes to like the B plus or B, kind of territory, then there's a real question. You have to consider, what else are you taking? How rigorous is your curriculum otherwise? You have to think about, well, what course even are we talking about? Like, is this an important course where you kind of need to take it? What alternatives are there? Is it just bumping down a level? Is it kind of now you can't take, whatever it is, chemistry, because if you don't take this level, there's not an option for you because of scheduling or whatever your school offers. So it really, really depends. And of course, it depends what your goals are in terms of college. So the more selective the school, the more you have to really think about every little, decision like this that you're making. But it really has to be made in the context of your larger curriculum. How rigorous is it? What are your grades and grade trends look like otherwise? And then what ultimately, generally speaking, you don't have to know the specific school, but what level of school are you shooting for? And you always have to remember that you're making this decision, not just like in a vacuum where can I get an A minus in this class? You have to be able to get, if you're a junior, for those of you out there who are juniors, you have to be able to get, let's say, an A minus in the class while you're also getting ideally A's or A minuses in the other 4 core classes and whatever else you're taking, while you're prepping for the ACT or SAT, while you're juggling your extracurriculars, and while you're hopefully having a little bit of a life and sleeping. So it's not just like, can I do well in this course? You've got to look at what you have to manage at the same time and see what answer you come up with. And it really does depend what the fuller picture looks like. But again, if you ask that of the colleges, they're going to give you the non-answer. But the truth is it depends on the student.
And Sasha, how do you recommend people plan for their testing? Like, when is it a good time to test? What is your recommendations around that.
Sure, and there's a couple questions about some things going on with the ACT,
Yes.
so I'll answer
Yeah,
that
we
with
can-
it, which
yeah.
is really that nothing has changed in my timeline of planning. I like to plan early, but that doesn't mean I want to start early, right? You can always plan to start late, but you can't do that when you start too late. So a sophomore year is the time to talk, right? That doesn't mean we're doing anything, but I have a big crop of sophomores coming in over spring break just to try out an SAT, try out an ACT, if they're not doing it at their schools. The next crop will happen in June. There's no preference. It's just whenever the kid is relaxed and has the time to do it. And that's really about figuring out that benchmark. Then we understand how far away we are from whatever the goals are, right? Because sometimes we're really close to our goals and sometimes we're not. And that's where you need to pick the right test. And I'm going to go into that a little bit in a second. And that's when you need to plan. Every kid's different. Our boarding school kids have a different life than our day school kids in terms of when they can prep and when they're home and when they can test, when their schools even allow them to test. So there's no one right time to test. The answer is all of our kids are testing junior year. Some of them are doing it really, really early in the fall. Some of them are doing it in the winter and spring. Some of them are doing it in the late spring and summer. And certainly everyone's tidying things up over the summer and into the fall. And this year, things will probably just get shifted a little bit more like they have before. And hopefully we'll be able to test safely this summer and fall and things will sort of get back to normal. But again, it's about planning at the end of 10th grade for whenever the right time is. And sometimes that's a long time from when you take your diagnostics and sometimes it's not. I know there are questions about the ACT because I was saying like a year ago, the ACT is going to give you retests of individual sections and all that. And I know it's very disappointing that they've taken that away right now. Bari and I didn't really know how I don't think colleges knew yet how they would look at those retests. I'm not sure I was ever going to really push those retests unless we really needed something. I mean, it's kind of the advice I've always given, which is let's get one amazing set of scores to send. And if you can't, sure, we can put a couple together. And if you can't, maybe we'll do this retest. But I like concise. I like one or two. And I don't know that Bari and I even know and will know yet how admissions officers, how seriously they will take those retests. So yes, it's frustrating because they would have been nice, especially for that pesky science section at the end. But I'm not sure they were ever going to be such a huge benefit from an admissions perspective. I'm not sure. And that's sort of right now, we're just in a holding pattern. Bari, did you?
Yeah, I agree. I think I was advising. I mean, by the way, the section retests they never happened. So it's not like it was taken away. Nobody had it yet. I know people might have been planning and hoping, but they never actually got to be rolled out. It never actually got to be rolled out. My take on it was the same as it is with SuperScore, which is that, and again, it all depends on where you're applying. But if you're applying to a place that's quite selective or just selective, they see everything that you submit. You can't just submit a section. They're going to use the best sections, but they see all of the sections from whatever test date you're sending, and they're going to evaluate you based on all of that. And so in an ideal world, you try not to have to use SuperScore if you don't have to. You can use it and it will be used, but ideally you don't have to use it unless it's really close, which is totally fine if you need to, a point or two at hitting one or another. But I didn't want my students to even consider the section retakes because I'm fairly certain, even if the colleges aren't certain about it themselves just yet, that they would, especially the more selective ones, would look unfavorably. It looks like you kind of can't hit it all at once, and it looks like you're kind of gaming it. For all the reasons we like it is the reasons they don't like it on the other side. So all the reasons it's appealing to students are the reasons that the colleges say, hey, maybe we should stop and think here. So I was and would have continued to encourage my students not to plan like, I could always retake that one section. Again, depending where you're applying, if it's a more moderately selective school or a less selective school, it's a different story. But a lot of colleges, you don't have to be like up here for them to be fairly picky about these things. So, for me, it also doesn't factor.
Can you, for a moment, Bari, or actually either Sasha or Bari, explain what super scoring is, because we do have some 9th, 10th graders who may or may not know about what it actually is.
Sure, I can take this one. So super scoring is actually technically, well, it started with the College Board and the SAT, and it was just it's the practice of mixing and matching different sub scores across different test dates. So you get an 800 on your SAT math, then you get a 700 on your SAT verbal, and then they switch the next time around because you're just having a great day. The opposite, your super score is a 1600, the best of both days, and what Bari was saying is that, yes, a school that will super score, not all, this is about each school. Some schools super score, some do not. Each one has its own policy, but regardless of their policy, they will see those 700s and those 800s, and they will also give you a super score. And I think the question is, what are you showing them? And are you showing them that you got a fluke score, or are you showing them some really fantastic scores that are super scored even higher? And the ACT, traditionally, schools haven't really used super scores for the ACT. Some have, but it's been less practiced from the admissions perspective. The ACT is pushing really hard right now for super scores because it's appealing to students. Students want the super score. So what the ACT is doing is preemptively creating a super score and pushing that super score to admissions officers. Again, if an admissions officer wants to see a super score, great. They may not. And what I want a student to send is 1 to 2 sets of amazing scores. I know there's a question about how often is too often to sit for these tests. And I would say that it's about sitting for them when you're ready and sitting for them when you are poised for success. There are safety valves, which we can get into on the phone if you're worried about it, for if something goes wrong when you test. It's not the end of the world. You can always fix it. But we want kids to have positive testing experiences. Our kids really shouldn't be testing more than 3 times. Many of them test once or twice. 3 times it happens too. I mean, it depends on why they're going for that. It's usually because Bari has told them they should get a 30, one more point. 30. I go, oh, okay, we're doing one more date. I'm kidding, but 2 to 3 times is very typical, but really no more than that. And we're not sending necessarily all of those scores. And again, we're really trying to just have kids sit when they're ready to perform their best.
And one thing about that is that you don't get like extra bonus points for getting it early versus a little mid-year versus later. And it can be very tempting, especially when you hear classmates or friends who went in and now are done or just are going in, whatever. It feels like you're behind or like you should be doing something. What other people do does not matter for you. All that matters is where you are and when you can grab your highest score, whatever that score is for you. And so don't get caught up in the noise about what other people are doing, because colleges aren't looking at what date you took it or not saying, oh, wow, they got that really early, or, oh, they got it really late. They just want to look at the score and move on. And that's ideally what you want them to do. You want the score to be at a certain point for whatever college you're looking at or applying to, where they look at the score and they spend no more than 5 seconds on it, where they don't stop and say, well, this could be a concern. And the way to do that is to plan ahead, like Sasha was saying. You plan, you prep, and you figure out, when can I kind of hit that point where my tutor says they think, the ceiling is. And it's important to have a good tutor who can give you honest feedback and not just kind of keep encouraging more and more hours, but not really give you a real sense of what realistically, but optimistically, and ambitiously, but realistically, you can expect to be your ceiling. Because I can tutor for 1 million hours, it doesn't mean I can get a perfect score.
Oh, yes, you can, Bari.
You
haven't worked with my math tutors. You absolutely can. But no, but Bari's right. And what I think the key here is good diagnosing and then constant, regular mock testing, right? So that's what Bari's talking about. If your child doesn't know where they are on a ACT or an SAT or an AP, whether or not they're at the beginning or the middle, you should always know where you are. And so you should always start with full length testing, and we do it by Zoom now, like everything else in the entire world. We have real proctors sitting there in a room, but that's what we do.
Please take full length tests. Don't take these hybrid, like easy pass, like kind of
And do it right with accommodations, the right timing. Do it. We print the tests and mail them to you. You're not doing it on a screen. You have your calculator, all of that. And then throughout the process, and mock testing becomes more and more important as you get closer to official testing, right? We're not trying to burn you out at the beginning of the program, but you should know as a parent or you as a child where you are on these tests, because there are lots of wonderful full-length tests available that are real official tests. You can take them and have them analyzed throughout the process. So you should know when you're ready for official testing, when you're ready for that pep talk right before official testing.
And Sasha, you just touched upon accommodations. Can you talk about the process for getting accommodations, what that looks like?
Yeah, accommodations can be really so important to a child's success on these tests. The first step is always the school. So should you think your child might need accommodations, and that is because they either receive accommodations in school, they use extra time in school, or maybe they have an IEP or a neuropsych evaluation with a documented learning disability, maybe they have a physical disability, maybe there are emotional reasons why you think there's a need for accommodations. There's lots of reasons why parents seek this out. They need proper documentation. They go through the school submits the application. It's usually very important that you're using those accommodations in the school setting, though it depends a little bit on what those accommodations are. The most common accommodation is time and a half, but kids have multi-day testing, use of a laptop for the essay, all sorts of things like that. And it all goes through the school. And proper documentation is the beginning of that process. And for us, we work with parents to understand where they are in that process, because I want to give diagnostic testing that is appropriate for that child. And if you give it to them with extra time and they're not going to get that extra time, you are really inflating those scores. And if they are going to get extra time and you give it to them without, or they don't have the proper accommodations, you really aren't getting a realistic starting point. And again, I think programs need to be organized and everything needs to be done in a simulated fashion so that you get really good data.
And there seems to be a lot of questions about the application process, the EG, that there was a significant amount of applications and how that's going to impact not only this year, but next year. So I don't know, Bari, would you like to tackle this?
Sure. So at many schools, but not all, obviously, the national pictures suggest that apps are down and that enrollment is down. But depending again on where you're applying, the reality is more that applications are up and up significantly. And we saw that particularly at highly selective schools. And early, we saw things as high as 57% in regular. Colgate is up 102% overall. This year over last. I've actually I wrote a couple down so I wouldn't mess them up, but just to give a sense, this is for overall, now that applications are in. So they're talking not just early decision, but overall applications. So BU up 24%, Colgate I mentioned, it's 102%, Harvard 42%, Haverford 16%, Middlebury is up 30%, NYU up 20%. They exceeded 100,000 applications this year, if you can believe it. Princeton up 15%, Swarthmore 12%, UCLA 28%, Penn 34%, Villanova 10%, and William and Mary 23%. Just to give you some of the ones that have announced so far. There'll be more numbers that come out as the season continues.
Is that because of the test optional or what?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I mean, we knew that was going to happen. If you've been tuning in since the spring when we thought this pandemic actually would no way still be happening in any meaningful way at this point, we still said, listen, once these schools went test optional, the applications are going to surge and they're going to go through the roof. That's what happens, by the way, when a school goes test optional under ordinary circumstances. They get more applications. And that, by the way, is one of the incentives for the college to go test optional, is because they'll get more applications and their admit rate will go down. This is no different. And of course, many students saw this, rightfully so, as their one real opportunity to get into some schools, because with taking the testing out, they could present a stronger profile. Now, I think there also was a lot of misinterpretation of this policy, thinking that, well, by taking testing out, either A, it made it somehow easier to get into a college if they were going to take the testing out, or that somehow a student's profile became stronger if they could take out that piece that they thought was a bit weaker for them. And it just doesn't work that way. Colleges are still looking for what they're looking for. We saw in general that students who submitted scores did better. Especially when you're looking at a reach school. Getting into a reach school without scores is possible. And in the past, we've worked with students where that was the case, but it was a very targeted, meaningful, thoughtful, intentional choice of a particular school where we felt that given what the transcript looked like, given what extracurriculars looked like, given the fit, the way the college would perceive a student, that it all then made sense. And again, it was so intentional and so particular for one school. And what we have this year is people saying, there's no testing at the Ivies. I can apply to as many as I want, and maybe I could get in. Remember that the surge doesn't also represent qualified candidates. All of them are not qualified. Many of them are easy no's. People who would have never gotten in before, and still, this doesn't change it. But people who nonetheless say, I want to throw my hat in the ring. At the same time, you'll see that there are students who are going to be able, this was a big win, where if they had a really strong transcript for whatever that means for wherever they applied, a really strong transcript, the extracurriculars were there, the fit was there, the essays are there, the recommendation supports what the student's profile says and how they're presenting themselves, that there are students who will have gotten into a school this year because this testing actually was pulled. But in general, it is not the case. And in general, you should try to take the test and you should treat it as if testing is not optional. And if you need to ultimately fall back on that, it's there as a net, but it should not be plan A for most people. There are some people that you take these tests at the beginning and you see like, it totally makes sense. And before the pandemic, by the way, that was the same thing. A student goes in and gets a 23 and they have like straight A's in the most rigorous curriculum and they get a 23 ACT, the chances of thinking they might hit a 34 or 35, I would defer to Sasha's team and say, hey, is this possible? But that's going to be harder. And a student like that may have automatically said or tutored for a bit and then made the final decision to say, you know what? It's not even going to come close. And we'll focus on the Bowdens and the Wesleyans and the University of Chicago's, the highly selective schools where the testing didn't have to be submitted. But that's the same thing. That hasn't changed. So I think the perception has changed more than the reality has.
And with this surge in applications, do they actually read them all?
Yeah, they have to. I mean, listen, they have to, right? So Stanford came out first, and then the Ivies the next day came out and said, we're no longer announcing by the end of March. We're going to push back our notification date to April 9th. So they pushed it back, almost 2 weeks because they usually notify a little bit before the end of March. And then they said they're going to give 2 extra days. Instead of May 1 being the reply date, you get till May 3rd because they're going to notify a little bit later. But they needed more time to review. And so they said, we got to give you notifications a little bit later. We've also seen the reverse. Some colleges giving out decisions a bit sooner because they know from an enrollment management perspective, the sooner a student hears that they got in, the quicker they'll be to latch on and potentially go. So if you can get to a student and say, we've accepted you, and they get excited about you, by the time 2 or 3 weeks later, they hear from another school, they've been all excited about your school. And the studies show that students who find out sooner are more likely to enroll. So there's a lot of stuff going on by the colleges, but if they don't have enough time, we're seeing colleges push it back.
So Bari, would you encourage the class of 2022 to apply early to college?
I would always, listen, from a purely strategic standpoint, in almost every instance, it makes sense to apply ED or early action when it's available. There are a couple of exceptions, certain schools where it's more difficult in early than regular, or where it's truly the same. So like Georgetown is harder in early than in regular. MIT is really the same in early or regular. So there are going to always be exceptions, but as a very general piece of advice and purely strategic, it would benefit you to apply in an early pool to a school that's a reach that makes sense from a fit perspective and where you're generally in range at least. academically. So the short answer to that question is yes, but there are always going to be exceptions. Also, sometimes students, it makes sense, they really should wait and show more of senior year grades, or it might be there like once every other year, or maybe now it's once every year. I have a student who just has this fear of commitment and doesn't feel comfortable committing somewhere. So they don't do ED, but everybody does at least EA. There's no binding commitment there. In almost every instance, it's still going to increase your chances. And from a psychological perspective, ideally, if you don't have to, you don't want to go into regular decision with nothing in your back pocket. It's just kind of terrifying because regular can be so unpredictable because the application numbers are so high, even in a normal year, and they've already filled a good portion of their class through early. There are a lot of highly qualified applicants that didn't get in early who very well could have and should have, but they end up in the pool. So it just gets really tough in regular. And so it just feels good, even if it's a safer option that you don't feel you're likely to go. It just feels good to know I got into college, I've got something to fall back on, and it's not going to be that I'm not going to get in anywhere kind of thing. But I would recommend, yes, that students apply early. Whether it's binding or not is a whole other story, depending on how much you like a school.
Are regular decisions also those applications up for regular decision, and why?
They're same reason, right? Test optional. More people got deferred and denied in early because those numbers were bonkers, right? Those were even higher, except with the exception of Colgate, where their early was actually down a little bit, and then they went crazy in regular. In most of the instances where the numbers have been announced already, where ED numbers were announced earlier, the overall increase is lower than it was if you just looked at the early pool. But it's the same reason. It's that it's test optional. It's that a lot of people obviously didn't make it through in the first early round. And so they're showing up here. And so the apps are up.
We have a whole bunch of questions coming in also. Sorry about this. If your child has time and a half on SAT, would any testing center actually provide this accommodation?
Sure, there's two separate things with accommodations. There's extra time and a half, and then there's special accommodations. And special accommodations always happen at a child's school. And general time and a half, there's national test centers everywhere. So with that route, if you have time and a half and that's the accommodation you have, it's like anyone else. There may not be test centers available because of what's going on in the world, but that's like every other kid, and you just work to try to get a test site. If you have special testing and it happens at your school, you have to coordinate with your school. And yes, if your school is not open, you'll have to talk to them about how to test. We did have students successfully test even when when the schools weren't open. Testing coordinators came in, things like that. But that's sort of something that's a differential between the two types of accommodations.
I've also had students over the years when there was an issue, whatever came up, we called like another school that did special testing, and they were kind enough to accommodate a student who was in a bind. I would say, generally speaking, you want to try and get it done at your school. That's always the easiest, especially if you have, a special circumstance. But if you really are in a bind and like your school's closed and they won't come in, you should try to connect with a school locally, that might be able to accommodate you, that is open. And your school coordinator can also help with that in making calls and trying to find you a spot. But always your school is the best and first bet.
There was a question about how many schools can you apply to early? And I wonder if it's helpful to differentiate between early decision binding, and early action.
Yep. Exactly. So it depends what policy the college has. So early decision is binding, which means that if they admit you, you must go. So you can obviously only apply to one school ED, because if they take you, you have to show up in the fall. So, and you sign an agreement, a parent has to sign the agreement, and your school counselor has to sign an agreement saying you unequivocally understand the agreement that you're entering into. So you can only apply to one school early decision. In theory, you can apply to as many schools as you'd like under early action, which is an early program where you apply early, you hear an answer earlier, but you're not bound to go if they take you. The college must hold your spot until May 1st. And then you can decide, you can see how everything else plays out, or if it's your first choice and you get in early action, because that's what the college offers, you can say, I'm done, send in your deposit in December and be done with it. Another just little, there's always like these little like kind of exceptions, but a handful of schools, so Harvard, Yale, not this year Princeton, because they went to one deadline, but in an ordinary year when Princeton has an early action and a regular decision, Stanford, they say that they have a restricted early action where you apply there early, you'll get an answer early. They have to hold your spot till May 1. You do not have to go if you get in early to Yale, but you can't apply anywhere else early decision. So you can't apply somewhere else that will bind you to go if they take you. And you can only apply early action to other colleges that are public universities, not private. So you can apply early action to Yale, but you can apply early action to University of Virginia, University of Michigan, UNC Chapel Hill, but you cannot apply early action to University of Chicago, which is a private school, or to MIT, which is a private school, even though MIT and University of Chicago don't care if you apply somewhere else. If you're applying early action. So if you're looking at some of these other schools that have a restrictive early action, just make sure you understand the policy. But the general thing is just that early decision is binding, only one. Early action, there's no limit to the number you can apply to unless you have a restriction on you, which will be very clear from the college's policy.
And how many schools should you be applying to? If you're looking at some really rigorous schools, and how many safeties?
Yeah, so, people ask this question often, and there isn't a magic number, but I would say around 8 to 10. 10 is a lot, and good luck also doing 10 supplements. It's not easy. And, even though we can recycle a little bit of material, if you're really doing them well, like each one is its own assignment and its own beast, so to speak. But I would say between 8 and 10, I have students who have more efficient lists, 6 or 7. It depends on what the range is and where you like. If you really like a place that we feel is going to be more likely to come through, we need a little bit less cushion. If you're somebody who's going to put a bunch of like reaches on, and from a counseling perspective, we think there are reaches also that are less likely to work out even from a reach perspective, you need more. Every list should be comprised primarily of what we would call target schools. And by target, don't think about my favorite store with the red bullseye. Some of them you're going to hit the bullseye, and some targets you're going to be in range and you're going to miss it. And people automatically think of the bullseye. And when you say target school, they think, oh, those are the ones where I'm going to hit it on the target. That's not what target means. It means you're in range and you're trying to hit the bullseye, and you're not going to hit it on all of them. And by the way, that's the hope, right? If you applied to 10 schools and got into all 10, you probably would say, hey, I might have misgauged on what I could have potentially, done here. So in an ideal world, if you really saw the whole process through and had to go into regular decision, you'd get a mixed bag. And hopefully a reach would come in because you picked an intentional reach, and one where you were advised that this is a reach that actually might find your application and your profile compelling. It doesn't have to do really anything at all with how badly you want to go. And it has nothing to do with if you could do the work there. It matters really how the college perceives you as a fit, which they gather from the essays and how you're presenting yourself and how your profile is coming together. So those are just some things to take into account.
And what would you say, how do you figure out what is a good fit?
It really start out with what you like. That's always where you begin. Which are the schools that appeal to you most? The part about like the academic piece, like where you kind of fall academically, is fairly straightforward. You can probably figure that out for the most part on your own. Remember that when you see SAT and ACT ranges, mid 50%, that the lower end doesn't necessarily mean that if you're in that lower end that you're in range, and that means you have an equal chance of somebody who's in the middle or somebody who's on the upper end or even outside of it. Those middle 50 percentiles represent a really, really broad applicant pool. And so you should be speaking with an advisor who can kind of tell you, where do you need to be, for this particular school from a testing perspective. And so
traditionally, Bari, we set that at the beginning of a program, and it's often based on the 75th percentile or above of admitted students. That's our safe way of saying that we feel that your SAT or ACT scores will help your application. You will be very safe if you're in sort of that 75th or above percentile of admitted students. So we're not looking at that 25th to 50th and saying, let's go for that 25th percentile and you're going to get the bullseye. We're saying, for the most part, our students are aiming for the 75th percentile or higher, and that allows them to be competitive. That's why they're taking it that third time in the fall. Right,
exactly. And this is also what Sasha is saying, is from the testing perspective. So what we don't want is the testing to hold us back, right? So if the testing door closes, then the other stuff kind of doesn't matter, right? But if we can keep the testing door open so we can pass through, then we can let our essays work for us. Then we can show them the fit. Then you can have everything kind of come together. And that's really where decisions are made. Without the rigor of your courses, without the grades, without the scores from Tutor Associates, like to help you through, when that door closes, there's only so much that we can move forward. We can, there's not much we can do if we know that the score is going to hold you back at a particular school. And colleges will tell you, you can ask them till you're blue in the face, like, are there any cutoffs? And when they say no, they are honest that there technically are not, but there absolutely are score points where once you're at a certain point, like nothing, it doesn't matter. Like, it's just going to knock us out. And like, you need that honest feedback. So, what am I shooting for, first of all, and where can I look and what are my chances? So the score piece has to do with, from a score perspective, that the score will kind of work for you and let you move forward. Then you pass through that and you get to the more subjective things that are things that we tend to work on.
And remember, the reason that Bari and I know these numbers is because they're published, and that's the reason why they matter. Both because I do think admissions officers often really do believe they are predictive of performance, and they need to be reflective of things, but also they are reporting their numbers of admitted students, and the admissions officers need to accept students with high scores in order to keep those schools really selective. So again, it's an entryway, and then once you get through it, they cease to matter, and it really is about your child.
Mm-hmm. And Sasha, you mentioned this before about super scoring, actually, instead of you, Bari, but if you could re-articulate, does the college actually see all your scores? That came up again, and I think it's a really important thing.
Great question. Yeah. So there's two separate things. There's, can you mix and match scores? And then there's, what do colleges see? So sometimes you can mix and match scores. That depends on what the college likes. Lots of them will let you mix and match. Some won't, and each college admissions officers will let you know. But either way, if you're mixing or matching, and no matter what, if you're mixing and matching scores, they see everything. Okay. So if you are going to super score, if a college allows you to super score, you are sending multiple sets of scores, and then they are super scoring. So you're not hiding any pieces of it, and you have to show it all, which is one of the reasons why Bari and I don't count on it, right? It's fine. It can be used effectively. Absolutely. It can be great, but it's not the thing we count on. In terms of showing scores to schools, super scored or not, do the schools see your scores? The answer is, you have a lot of control over your scores. They're in your account, and you actually, when you apply, you'll pay, of course, you pay at every stage to release the scores to the schools. So in that sense, you have a lot of control, and you can cancel tests if, I don't know, you got really sick in the middle of the test and it went horribly. You have time to cancel, and you can delete things. And so we can all take a deep breath and know that we have some control over what schools see. But ultimately, some schools will ask you to show all of your scores. They say, we like to look at everything. Some high schools put your scores on your high school transcript. We need to be thoughtful about when we're testing. We need to be thoughtful about which scores are in our College Board or ACT account. And then ultimately, you work with your counselor to make sure that you're sending scores that help you.
And there's a question about mixing and matching scores at the Ivies in Georgetown. So Georgetown says you have to send all scores. They actually are so ridiculous. They're changing their policy now that there are no subject tests, which they were desperately hanging on to for dear life, is that even if you took some prior to the announcement, you need to send them. And now they're encouraging AP scores. I mean, it's just beyond ridiculous. But they actually say that you can't super score, like that you have to send all scores. So it's really a non-issue for them. And again, back to the mixing and matching, it's also an SAT versus ACT thing, like Sasha mentioned a little earlier, if everyone caught that, with the SAT, it's kind of like mixing and matching, meaning taking, the verbal and taking, a math score from two different test dates has kind of been the way it's always been and the way it's done. It doesn't matter if you're like 30 points within. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about real lopsidedness, that idea of let me go in and focus on one and let me go in and focus on the other and thinking that that's a good strategy. Like that's not the strategy you want, where they see two really like off scores and it seems like it's a fluke or like you're actually trying to game it. That's not going to work in your favor. And in most instances, they're seeing all the scores. There will be some colleges, if you ask them, they'll say, the scores come in a computer, the computer pops up the highest score, and that's all we see. Those, again, it depends where you're applying. It depends how selective the school is, but you should assume that the school is going to see, for the test dates you're submitting, all of the sections, and that even if they're going to take the highest scores, they're going to evaluate you on all the information that they have. So in theory, yes, you can mix and match, but you want to be mindful of what is your mixing and matching add up to and look like. Because plenty of times we're submitting two different test dates, particularly for SAT to get the higher score. But again, we're talking about things being like here and here and getting the higher score because of it, not like here and here. ACT sometimes can be a little trickier. And Sasha was referring before to deleting scores. On the ACT, if it really bothers you, you can just delete the score from your record period. Whereas on the SATs, and the subject test for when they existed, they just become part of your permanent record, but you do have control over which ones you choose to send to which college. And you can do different things for different places. So you can send everything to Georgetown, but you can send only the ones you want to Penn, for instance.
We talked a bit about the application, testing, interviews. If you think you will interview well, are there certain schools that have interviews? How would you structure that if you think your student is a good interviewer?
Yeah, so unlike in everything else in life where the interview is the real clincher, in college admissions, it has little to no value at all. You still should do it. So if a college offers it to you, of course, you make yourself available, unless you have a really, if it's a really, like, I think there's been like 2 kids over the years where it really just wasn't going to be good for them. And we advise just don't do it. But in almost all instances, the kids are going to be in a good position and we prep them and they know what to expect going in and everything. But this is one of the ways that college admissions is just a little bit funky and that it doesn't work like the real world. This year we saw a little bit more, I don't want to say emphasis, but it seems like they were maybe utilizing for a little bit more information. Yale, for the first time, said, we're going to pick who we want to interview because it's for people we want more information from, which was like terrifying, right? If you're in early and like they either contacted you or didn't contact you, it's like, do you want more information because you like me, or you want more information because you're not so sure about me? But the way it seemed to, when I spoke to colleagues more broadly, it seemed like it didn't really matter, like deferrals and admits, it really was across the board. And I spoke to a colleague of mine at Yale, and she had given me that information during the cycle, that it really wasn't an indication of how the decision was going. It really was kids that they wanted a little bit more information from. That was an anomaly. And generally speaking, though, it's what good applicants do. You interview, and it's just another part of the process. But don't think that like if academically it's really borderline and you're going to be like an amazing interviewer, that's going to change the decision. And alumni interviews are really tricky because they're like loose cannons, alums. You never know what you're going to get as far as like questions and what they ask and all this crazy stuff. A lot of them are also very sweet and they like really talk kids up. I'm going to do whatever I can to get you in. Oh my God, you're the best I ever interviewed. And it's like, they have no say in the process. And like, just be careful when you're with alums who may either be on the other end, if they might be a bit tough, or if they might be like overly encouraging and acting like they're the dean of admissions and they're going to make it happen for you. They really don't have any power in the process. But good applicants interview. They prepare. Don't interview like in your junior year, like interview when you're a senior and you have a better sense of what you want and where that college is on your list relative, to your first choice, and where you're more knowledgeable about the college and where you have more to share about yourself, so don't rush to do the interview either too early, because they do write up a little report and it does become part of your file, but it's just not an important factor. And then we're just at about 6 o'clock, so we should, just wrap up and take maybe a couple more questions.
Is a 1500 super score with super 1400s on each test viewed the same as a 1500 score on a single test?
Yeah, I think this comes down to what Bari was saying about the school and what's being seen, right? People read applications. And so if they see a 1500, which is a fantastic super score, by the way, so great work, and they see another kid who did it all at once, they see what they see. And I think we prefer them to just see it all in one shot. That being said, that's a really compelling super score and it's fantastic. And I think people would.
It depends what the rest of it looks like too, right? And it depends how you're getting to the 1500, right? There's so many different ways to get there. At some schools, like being in the 1400s does kind of knock you out, and that won't be good enough. And at other places, you're going to get a merit scholarship. It so depends on the school. It so depends on fit. It so depends on what everything else looks like. But as best you can, you want to try and hit it on the ACT and the SAT in as few sittings as possible, leaving open a little bit of flexibility, again, with a little bit of variation. So, like I said, like SAT, maybe more around like 30-ish point spread, and the ACT a couple of points, ish. But 1 point on the ACT is a big deal. Anyone who's taken it knows it's not easy, to move a composite up 1 point. It sounds like nothing, but there's a big difference between a 33 and a 34.
We get our calculators out and we go, how much more does this have to go to nudge it up? And you have to get the 0.5 because they round up, and
right. And there's a difference between a 34 and a 35. There's a big difference between a 33 and a 34. It doesn't sound like it when you're nitpicky, in the admissions business, it is. And so, it's not so easy to move. But in as few sittings as possible. And then when you can super score and, when it makes sense, you'll be able to do that.
Are there questions that should be answered that I haven't had the opportunity?
I think Bari and I are also always willing to follow up. We like talking to moms and dads. And I know there are always specific questions about your child, and those are different than like, what does the landscape look like? Yes. So I know once the recording is ready, Bari will send it around and our contact information. So if you have more questions, we'll do this again. And
absolutely.
Yes, we will send it around by tomorrow. And then if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to us directly.
Well, you've been amazing, as always, like a wealth of information, and you always deliver it in the most enthusiastic and non-threatening ways. So it's really wonderful.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks, Leslie. You're the best. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. It's a little bit of a wild ride, but we're here with you. So we'll be announcing more webinars. We've been doing this since the pandemic started, and we're not going to stop. So stay tuned, and we'll continue to update you with the news as it's announced and the information that we have, and give the best advice we can give to make everybody more sane and to make this process more manageable. So thanks to everybody, and have a great night.